Good afternoon, good evening, depending on your time zone. I am Dania Thafer, the Executive Director at Gulf International Forum. Thank you for joining us for this discussion today. It is our distinct privilege and honor to have General Zinni for a conversation on forming a sustainable defense structure in the Gulf. Before beginning, if anyone has any questions, please post them early on in the Zoom Q&A section. Now I will begin by outlining the broad issues that will inform some of the key themes of our discussion today. The Middle East Strategic Alliance was publicly proposed at the Riyadh Summit in May 2017. I'm sure all of you remember it by the infamous golden orb taken at the summit. MISA was supposed to be a security partnership between the 6 GCC nations, Jordan and Egypt. Many have described it as the Arab NATO, a concept that has been in discussion under several US administrations for decades now. In spite of the GCC states' purchase of hundreds of billions of dollars in weapons and decades of Western mentorship and training, a regional defense structure in the Gulf has always evaded us. Divergences about perceived threats and changing regional dynamics has caused a reoccurring dilemma for the GCC states between the maintenance of regional security and the preservation of domestic security interests. The intersection of two major events that have reshaped the strategic calculus of regional actors are one, which we all know, the Arab Spring, in which we witnessed a fall of a traditional leadership in the Middle East, and the other is the United States, arguably, diminished strategic interests in the Gulf. These two combined have created a vacuum of security leadership. This new security reality has caused division within the region. The 2017 Gulf crisis has severely damaged the prospect of a collective and defense body. The GCC as a bloc has fractured, leading to a scramble for individual interests that often supersedes a collective security framework. Within the current security dilemmas of the Gulf, how can the region create a sustainable defense structure? How can the US work with the Gulf states to effectively cooperate on counterterrorism, maritime security, and air defense? Would participation in MISA draw Washington deeper into regional conflict, or is it in the strategic interest of the US to support such an institution? We are very fortunate to host the Honorable General Anthony Zinni, an exceptionally qualified individual for a conversation on the Gulf's regional security. General Anthony Zinni was appointed Central Commander-in-Chief in 1997 after a long and distinguished career in the United States Marine Corps. He completed his tour and retired in 2000. He has participated in presidential diplomatic missions to Somalia, Pakistan, Ethiopia, and Eritrea. Additionally, the State Department missions involving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and conflicts in the Persian Gulf region, Indonesia, and the Philippines. General Zinni has an extensive experience in the Gulf region, about 30 years, dating back to his early years in the Marine Corps. His military service includes several deployments in the Gulf, in addition to several other regions worldwide. He has considerable operational experience in the Gulf. To name a couple, he was involved in the planning and execution of Operation Proven Force and Operation Patriot Defender during the Gulf War. General Zinni received so many awards in the service of our great country. If I recited them, I'm afraid we would use all of our time. I will only mention the Defense Distinguished Service Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster and the famous Purple Heart. He received 23 personal awards and 37 unit service and campaign awards. He also was honored with several civilian awards. General Zinni has written numerous articles, op-ed pieces, and monographs Two notable publications are his books, both New York Times bestsellers, Battle Ready and Battle for Peace. He has held positions on several boards of directors, as a board of directors in several boards, and advisor of major companies and institutions. He is now working on his doctorate degree at Creighton University. Throughout General Zinni's career, the United States government has made numerous attempts to create a Gulf security structure, a goal that still remains elusive. And today we would like to pick his brain on why this has not happened and its prospects in the future. Now I will turn the conversation to General Zinni. General Zinni, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for the conversation today.
Thank you, Dania. I think my mother wrote that introduction that you just gave. Well, I think ever since I've been involved in the Middle East, and it's now 30 years, we have sought some sort of arrangement, some sort of security arrangement, or even broader arrangement that included economic cooperation, cooperation on energy, cooperation on the political diplomatic side. Various administrations have been maybe more aggressive or less aggressive. Moods in the region kind of vary in terms of willingness to start a process or at least consider a process. The latest evolution is, as Dania mentioned, MESA, the Middle East Strategic Alliance, and I know Kirsten Fonterose is one of our attendees, and I think she deserves the credit in providing the energy behind that. And that was an attempt to get some sort of start in constructing an alliance. There was a lot of myth built up around it. It wasn't the United States having a total plan and then going out and trying to convince everybody to sign up to it. It was to start a process by which the countries out there, beginning with the GCC plus Egypt and Jordan, to sit down and construct whatever the region could bear and start a process that we saw maybe evolving over time. But let me go back a little bit and just say that, ever since the United States has been deeply involved in the security in the region, and of course that goes back to the 1970s and really the Carter administration, when we sort of took on the responsibility, if you will, of Middle East security. Of course, in those days, worrying about the Soviet Union, we tried to structure some sort of arrangement out there. If you remember back, CENTCOM's creation, the Rapid Deployment Joint Task Force, and then became, under the Reagan administration, CENTCOM, a unified command. It was designed to counter any Soviet attempt to dominate the region, obviously primarily for energy reasons. We had built the two-pillar strategy where the Shah's Iran and Saudi Arabia, we saw as the basis of an arrangement out there. Of course, after the Iranian Revolution, we went to a strategy of dual containment and protected the flow of energy out there in the 80s and the flagging of the tankers. And then, of course, in the 90s, we had the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, if you will, with Desert Storm. There, we were able to get what we called the Gulf Coalition. And I think that one reason why that we were able to do that is obviously the blatant aggressiveness of Saddam Hussein, but also that the Bush administration at that time, H.W. Bush, was able to gain a United Nations Security Council agreement for the use of force, which made it easier to come together. We had a very awkward military arrangement, if you recall, with Prince Khalid commanding and leading the Gulf forces, the Arab forces in general, and of course General Schwarzkopf, the other allied forces. We sort of, after that war, we kept referring to the Gulf Coalition. In my time at CENTCOM, as a commander of the Marine Forces, then deputy commander, then commander of CENTCOM, we would keep using that term, the Gulf Coalition. And I know our Gulf partners used to smile at that and say, what is this coalition? I mean, it was never formalized. it was really a series of bilateral relationships, and I want to come back and talk a little bit about that. And you know, we made it seem like we had maybe a more formal relationship than we did. We really felt at that time we wanted to get to a more formal status with the relationship, especially in some areas as we saw threats beginning to form in the region, not only Iran, but others, and obviously the threat of extremism. And we were trying to get more cooperative action in things like air and missile defense and counterterrorism, several areas where it does really take some sort of interoperable and unified structure. There were hopes that the GCC could be the centerpiece or core for this, but that didn't turn out, and the GCC sort of withered on the vine, if you will, especially in terms of military capability. And so, you know, as administrations came and went, there were varying degrees of interest, as I said before, in pushing this. The current administration, with the idea of this MESA, wanted to, I think, try to solidify a more formal arrangement and broaden it out a bit, not just in terms of security, but see if there was interest in working in areas like energy and also the political or diplomatic side, and also economic side. I was asked to head up a team where we were able to get representatives from Department of Defense, State Department, National Security Council, and Department of Energy. And our pitch out there when we went out is to say, we're not coming with something like a formalized plan. We're here to start a process, and we want to build it based on what those in the region, those of you in the region, want it to be. But we need to get it more formal, because in order for us to do things like effectively provide security, effectively operate in the area, and again, look at the areas of energy and economics and work them on a more cooperative basis, we need to start a process. And we don't want you to feel the United States is trying to impose one on you. So our initial proposal was to get an agreement to start a process, to get a memorandum of agreement that says at least these initial countries, again, GCC plus Egypt and Jordan, we would work to start to see what we could do in this area, how far we could take it. Down the road, additional nations might join. We may go further on one pillar than another, but we needed to start some sort of more formalized cooperative process. Now, what did we run into is we ran into mixed reactions to this. And many of the reasons why it was difficult to get this moving were things that I'd heard in the past. And given the audience here, I think things that everybody knows. One, there are different views of the threat. And different ways of dealing with it, even if there's acknowledgement of the threat. Don't be provocative, and maybe one side wants to be more confrontational and the other side doesn't. Another concern was a formulation like this could lead to certain countries in the area being dominant. Always a worry about, well, is it going to be Saudi and the UAE dominating some sort of structure? There were concerns, and this is one I heard just about everywhere else, that it might take away from the bilateral relationship with the United States. I think every place I went, I heard this cannot affect our bilateral relationship. That has to be strong. There were those that felt trying to do 4 pillars was too much. Let's focus on security. And others felt, no, this is good to have 4. And then something that I think if you've been in the region for a while, or if you're from the region, you know darn right well, the region is much more diverse than people think, looking in from the outside. I mean, there's this sort of myth of ethnic and religious solidarity, brotherhood, sisterhood, if you will. But when you go out there and you peel that onion back, you find out that's not true. And there's the problem of history, too. I mean, there are issues that are set in the region that have a history to them. A lot of times this doesn't come to the surface, but you know, we have squabbles between ruling families. We have other things that go on that make it difficult to pull it together in any one way. And I think another thing you realize after being out there for decades is interests aren't the same. It would appear that they might be the same, I mean, this is not Western Europe, post Second World War, where maybe there was more of a coalescence of interests and views of the threats and things like that. So all these things, and I'm sure others that are in the audience that can mention, made it much more difficult to pull this together. In my time as the CENTCOM commander, when we had to take an action, for example, when Saddam violated the no-fly zones, no-drive zones, maritime intercept operations and all, I would have to go around to each individual nation to get permission to obviously use their airspace, launch from the bases there, and work in some sort of cooperative way. Obviously, for a military person, that's very awkward. You oftentimes don't get that kind of time. And so one of the reasons to have a more integrated formal relationship is that you can respond quicker. One of the things that I really tried to push as CENTCOM commander, and I know General Mattis after me and others, was to try to get something like an air and missile defense cooperative system put in place, because that's one thing where you have seconds to respond, not weeks to put together. I know MESA is still a process that has hope behind it, and people are working on it. I had a dialogue with Kirsten in the past couple of weeks about that. And to me, I hope we keep pushing on that, because we need an arrangement. One of the things, and I will close with this, open up the questions. One of the things that we decided when we were out last year was that if it was difficult to identify a threat and identify an action to be taken regarding that threat, well then let's not use that as a key to have the alliance. We don't need to articulate a threat. We can begin.
I think his computer froze. Just give it 1 second and he will be back with us. Okay, there we are. I think General Zinni is here.
Yeah, I don't know what happened. I don't know if the weather or whatever, but something's down.
Okay, that's understandable. It happens. Okay, excellent. So I guess, are you going to be here by voice only?
Yes.
Okay. Well, anyway, so thank you for coming back in this. I know it's difficult that we're highly dependent on technology these days for everything, even our meetings. Okay, so I will go ahead and ask you some questions. The audience have posed many questions as well. I think one big one is a crucial dimension of the Gulf's security environment is precisely the issue of whether the U.S. is likely to maintain a strong strategic presence in the Gulf region. Has there been a change in the U.S. strategic calculus for being the main security guarantor in the Gulf? Is there a role for other major players? And another issue maybe is a couple of weeks ago that the U.S. removed Patriot anti-missile systems from Saudi Arabia, and is considering reductions to other military capabilities. In your opinion, is this part of the U.S.'s overall strategy to draw down its security role in the Gulf, or was it merely a tactical move?
Well, first of all, if you sort of step back and you look at, what are U.S. interests in the Gulf, I mean, obviously the energy resources in the Gulf are important to the world economy, and even though we contend we're self-sufficient and if need be in energy resources, if the global economy is affected by lack of access to the energy resources from there, it's going to affect our economy anyway. So there's an energy economic rationale. I think there's also, if you look at the trade routes of the world, I mean, from a military perspective, we've always looked at the Straits of Malacca through the Strait of Hormuz to the Bab el-Mandeb to the Suez Canal, and you look at the economic trade that goes through that region, the criticality of it. I mean, even the Chinese are realizing that now in terms of their Silk Road initiative and the ability to try to gain greater influence and through that network, if you will. I think also we've seen that instability in that part of the world has global effect and impact. So from the perspective of do we have interests, I think regardless of the administration, you have to say yes. Now, this current administration obviously was pushing MESA. MESA obviously, in whatever form it would have taken or might take, does commit us. And so I think we could mistake the need or the, I think, rationale for not getting involved in endless conflicts and to think through our military commitments out there that might be more tactical decisions now and more decisions that were based on maybe some poor strategic decisions on use of force that immediately after 9/11 that we made. But I don't think in the long run we can escape the vital interests that that region presents. Of course, you know, politics being politics, who knows? But I think we've overstressed this shift to the Pacific or this repositioning to the Pacific. Really, when you look at the Pacific and you look at the interests out there and you look at the Chinese, they're coming west, and their interest in this part of the world and the region. Of course, Russian interest in this part of the world. I think that it's clear that we will have a continuing security requirement in the region. Obviously, you know, I think you brought up the American arms sales in the region, which I know for this administration is a big consideration. From a military perspective, we like interoperability. We don't like to see systems there that are not compatible with ours, or actually, in some cases, like air defense systems, which could threaten our operations in the region. So I think in many ways, those in the region that make those decisions have to decide on what they acquire, because it may make our ability to provide security more difficult. I think it's in everybody's interest, saying this, you know, kind of remove myself from either giving an American perspective or a regional perspective, but I think it's in everybody's interest out there to build some sort of cooperative arrangement. That arrangement should be something that we begin and we start with the immediate need for defense and security. We don't have to get into identifying particular threats, but get more into what it would take for us to operate cooperatively. I think the other thing that's critically important out there for any of this to happen is internal regional cooperation. I mean, we have the Qatar dispute. We have some underlying disputes between other countries out there with each other. We have some really sour relationships, particularly Egypt and the United States, that obviously goes back to Arab Spring and to the Brotherhood and all the strains they put on our relationship back then. In my mind, that's critically important to repair. From a military perspective, you don't get into the region unless you have Egyptian cooperation like we used to have. We always had, you know, priority of movement of military assets through the Suez Canal, overflight rights, use of Cairo West. The Egyptians have always been strong partners in anything we have done out there on a military basis. They provided a division, the Gulf Storm, sent a brigade to Somalia with our forces out there. So it's a valuable ally that has drifted, the relationship has drifted apart, and it's another one that has to be repaired. So, I mean, it's a long-winded way of saying there are bilateral relationships that need to be strengthened and need to be built upon in order to get to a more cooperative regional system or more formal relationship.
Okay, so as you have obviously said that the MESA has been slow getting off the ground, the GCC states have also preferred bilateral relations with the US instead of multilateral. And I've seen that at the macro level and also at the micro level. When I was at NDU, when we bring delegations from the Gulf, in the absence of true political consensus, would you think it's unreasonable to expect a strategic alliance? How would such a framework even work?
Well, I think it's reasonable to consider that this is more viable than continuing to work on a set of bilateral relationships. The bilateral relationships are awkward when you try to put something together where regional cooperation is necessary. And if you bring in not only U.S., but, you know, in the past, we've had allied forces on the ground there too, from, you know, UK, France, other places. If you don't have a structure in place, obviously your ability to get to the scene of the crime is really hindered, and time could be critically important. It also means that if you're trying to work out the protocols and the interoperability requirements without having them preset in some sort of arrangement, it makes it much more difficult. So continuing a bilateral relationship as a basis for security in the region, I think, especially with the advanced technology we face now, the timelines, the greater interest we're seeing outside powers beginning to show in the region, China, Russia, others, some of the instability in the region, you know, we have new players, really, the countries like Turkey playing a greater role, situation in Syria, deterioration in places like Yemen. So, you know, we are going to find ourselves continuously with problems that can pop up very quickly, and our ability to respond hindered by the lack of some sort of interoperable cooperative arrangement.
Yes, and one aspect you mentioned that would be probably important for the U.S.'s interest or cooperation, U.S.'s cooperation in the region, is if they really created this defense security framework. I know that the U.S. placed a caveat that it would not include the criteria most important to regional states such as Egypt, in which you said is a pivotal state to participate in this, that a mutual security agreement similar to Article 5 in NATO, in which all MISA countries, including the U.S., would respond to an attack on one as an attack on all. With such a clause in place, what would be another incentive to establish a regional security alliance, aside from that, which I think is very important to our regional allies?
Yeah, well, I mean, that may be very difficult for the countries in the region, maybe even for the U.S. in some circumstances to respond to it. I know, we all know the issues of concern that maybe if one country out in the region has an issue with another country and it ends up, you know, something like what happened in Yemen, the others don't want to feel compelled to respond. You know, what does it mean if you have a clause like that about something that the U.S. gets involved in that is not a regional issue? Does that require regional nations to provide forces to go off somewhere else in the world? So it gets more complicated. I think we get too hung up on this NATO model. You know, there are all sorts of reasons why a NATO model would not fit in the region. And so the circumstances for cooperation and response might have to be shaped differently, maybe more specifically, not as broad and general as Article 5. And so one of the things that with MESA is we said, let's talk about that. Let's not automatically go to a sort of a blanket generalized commitment. Is there ways you want to shape this or caveat it in some way where it's more palatable for the countries in the region too? You know, what we should not make a mistake in thinking is that just because you have the mechanism in place, the conditions for activating the mechanism may be different. What I mean by that is, let's say we have a cooperative air and missile defense system. It's in place. Now, the political decisions in terms of activating it or using it or whatever, that may have to be constructed differently. But if you don't have it, it's sort of a moot point when you need it. If missiles are coming in, and you have no way to respond. So again, we get hung up over NATO. We should not try to get ourselves trapped into that as the model. We may have to, and this was one of the things we communicated in the efforts to get the MESA off the ground, is let's construct it to what it fits in the region and what the countries in the region can accept.
Yes, and one key theme I think you've highlighted in our discussion is interoperability. And the GCC states have resisted to a certain extent integrating and pooling their defense capabilities, even though this means forsaking their military efficacy. However, there are varying levels of collaborative opportunities with regards to collective security. For example, the missile defense prospect, which you've mentioned, are maybe high for collective measures. What do you think are the primary obstacles for the achievement of interoperability or a collective defense strategy from that perspective? And what do you see as the primary opportunities?
Well, you know, from a military perspective, interoperability means whatever systems we have, weapon systems, communication systems, all that, can function together in one collective approach to dealing with whatever the threat is. Now, in the past, I know when I was CENTCOM commander and we started discussions on this, there was a concern by some of the countries that, well, wait a minute, is this a move to try to force us to buy very complex high technology systems, you know, which we maybe can't afford in some cases? And the answer was no. It's to take what you have and integrate it. But what you have has to be able to be integrated. In other words, if you're buying Soviet air defense systems, that may be difficult. And you know, and so we, you know, from my perspective as a CENTCOM commander, I want that interoperability, and however we can get it. If you have a British Rapier system or an old Hawk system, and others have Patriots, well, what can we do to make those all talk to each other, operate in some sort of collective manner to respond? You know, oftentimes a criticism is that, well, is this an attempt to sell, you know, military hardware? There's a greater requirement here for interoperability on a military need basis, and you can come as you are with what you have, but we've got to be able to integrate it. We can't fly planes out there through 5 or 6 different air defense systems and be responsive to any kind of threat. It creates too big a challenge if we haven't prepared to integrate it. And, you know, we get hung up on things like that, but there are other areas of cooperation, for example, on counterterrorism, you know, on intelligence sharing, even on things like, you know, should we end up with somebody trying to mine the waters in the Gulf? How do we operate with a collective ability to detect mines and clear mines, you know, and wherever they may come from? So, I mean, we've had instances where mines have been put in place and we can suspect who might have done it, but they're there and they have to be taken out. How do we work a collective approach? Another thing I would say is on some of these areas where we take a collective approach, it might be that not everybody has the same role in this. It might be some of the nations would take a certain capability and others would take different ones. So there's many ways you can shape this. But like any military person would tell you, if we don't have the planning and the cooperation ahead of time, we're behind when when the incident occurs that we have to respond to.
Well, yeah, unfortunately, history has shown that the GCC unites militarily or strategically in times of great crisis. Do you think that something like MESA would emerge out of an intense security crisis, just as the GCC did in response to the Iranian Revolution? Or do you think that's too late?
You know, what I found in my time out there, there's always a crisis. You know, I mean, and none of the crises in the past have, you know, generated the ability to cooperate in this way. So
I don't think it's a matter of a crisis forcing this. I think it's going to be a matter of sitting down, airing out what the problems are and the disconnections and the reasons why it can't be done, and starting a process to get us there. As a matter of fact, I would say usually when things like this are the products of a crisis, they're not put together as well as if they're done, in cooperation in a very deliberate way, rather than in a rush and in a response to a particular crisis.
One main question that I see is often posed by our audience is about the GCC crisis. As I mentioned, there's a vacuum in Middle Eastern regional leadership caused by both the perception of U.S. Decreased involvement and the realities of the post-Arab Spring era. This has resulted in larger states such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE to jockey for power and proactively address regional threats through more aggressive strategies. Now, how has the changing behavior of larger states affected the regional security architecture, and how does this affect the security status of smaller states? And in this context, can small states have an equal footing in a strategic alliance such as MISA? What is your opinion on what smaller states should do in this current environment?
Well, I think the smaller states are still independent political entities. They can't just be rolled up under a larger state determining their political decisions on all this. So I do think we have to construct this in a way where they have an equal say or equal commitment in this. Now, that they obviously aren't going to be able to provide the resources, but in some ways they can have specific niche things that they do. One of the proposals in Department of Defense came up with in MESA is forming these centers of excellence in different areas involving security. I mentioned some like air and missile defense and counterterrorism, maritime security operations, but each of the smaller states can take one of those and create ones that their resources, their ability to support would allow them to then to have a hub or a center of excellence where we come together and develop the concepts with that. So that's one way to sort of equalize things out. But again, we can't, we would not want to construct some sort of system where there were dominant states that determine what smaller states had to commit to. I don't think the smaller states would accept that out there. I'm sure they wouldn't. Their relationships with each other differ greatly, as anybody's been out there for a while understand. So, it would have to be constructed in a way where we respect the political independence and sovereignty of each state as having a voice.
And in regards to interoperability, which is something that we discussed, and military capabilities in the region, is it viable that the U.S. will realign military resources to Asia? What would happen if the U.S. relocated assets such as a replacement surveillance satellite, for example? Right now, the American satellite surveillance speed is likely adequate to detect any Iranian launch. But under the current circumstances, if the U.S. withdrew its assets, can the GCC appropriately defend themselves without a regional collective security framework?
Well, you have to understand that if something happens in another part of the world where the United States finds itself in a conflict, it's obviously going to move resources to that part of the world. CENTCOM is not one of the theaters that has what we call assigned forces. There aren't any really permanent forces in the region. There's the Fifth Fleet, which is really a headquarters. The ships come and go from other areas. They may come from the Sixth Fleet to serve a time in the Fifth Fleet, then go back, and basically they're headquartered on the East Coast of the United States. And so, you know, forces, the United States moves forces around and can concentrate forces where it's needed. When I was CENTCOM commander, and I know that others felt the same way, I did not want assigned forces because the region basically did not like any kind of permanent presence of U.S. forces. You know, other than the Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain, traditionally, only in crisis did we status in any way. And the operational forces, again, the ships and the battalions and all that, they come and go. They're not based there in any long-term permanent commitment. So, you know, satellites can move, ships can move, troops can move, and you're going to go to where the need is. If there was a crisis in the Pacific, we would move forces there. We would attempt to at least provide enough forces to maintain some sort of defensive posture in other parts of the world or security until we resolve the issue someplace else. But the U.S. doesn't plant forces in many places. We try to be as flexible as we can with the application of our forces. You know, there's a difference between forward presence in that, you know, ships come through, troops come out and exercise, and forward basing. And basing, you know, other than in times of crisis, has been something that the region has been a little nervous about. Now, recently, after the events, we've had a more sustained presence out there in places like Al Udeid and you know, and a sustained presence in naval forces in the Gulf and some others. But it was never intended to be a permanent basing arrangement. And again, the U.S. is going to move forces to where they become threatened. I mean, it could be that we move forces out of the Pacific to the Middle East. That's happened before.
Yes, and so many questions about the GCC crisis. Do you think it's something that can be resolved soon? And if not, how would such a regional cooperation work under the current circumstances?
Well, I mean, under the current circumstances, you're back to operating purely with bilateral arrangements. And the U.S. tends to be, because of the bilateral arrangements, the glue, if you will. So if something had to be done, we're going to have to go to each individual country based on our bilateral relationship and try to get some sort of level of commitment, you know, in terms of either contribution of forces, acceptance to base forces, diplomatic approval to move forces through space and the territory. You know, all those things then have to be put together again through bilateral relationships, which is very awkward. It requires us losing a lot of time in our ability to respond. I would hope that we could see, you know, the relationships within the region solidify more. That's a political issue, which then becomes a security issue because of lack of cooperation. But you know, until we see resolution of the issues with Qatar, and we see the resolution, you know, with some of the strained relationships with some of the other countries, with some of the bigger countries, you know, we're going to run into a problem. To be honest with you, from my perspective, the regimes that I worked with and the leadership that I worked with out there were able to resolve or at least get through these issues more so than I see now. It seems that they become more intensified rather than easing up. Just take the Qatar situation, for example. I mean, the number of Qataris and Saudis and Emiratis that are intermarried, that have collective families, is great. And you would think you could overcome political differences based on that relationship. But it gets worse rather than better. It's difficult to even get the parties to the table. I mean, the United States offered to mediate the process or to support a mediation. For example, the Kuwaitis were trying to mediate the dispute, and we offered to provide support for them, or to do the mediation ourselves, or to try to bring to become facilitators, if not mediators, whatever it would take to at least get a dialogue going. But that's been impossible.
Yeah, so as many analysts and you are saying, it's not looking very optimistic that this crisis will be resolved soon, but we can be hopeful.
Well, I get my hopes up every once in a while when it looks like there might be a dialogue, or somebody's going to go to somebody else's capital, or there's going to be some talks at some level, but they don't seem to go anywhere. I mean, it's hard to get a process started. In my experience in peace mediation work that I've done, the whole trick is to get a process moving. And it could start at a very low level. It could just begin to open up and to begin talking about the issues. And the problem has been the disputes are taken out in the media and in the press, which just exacerbates the situation rather than helps it. It needs to be done initially quietly, and maybe initiated at a much lower level, maybe even track 2 to begin with, and then begin more formal talks as we begin to set up the conditions for those. But a process has to get started in some way, and the lack of a process even being initiated is what discourages people.
Yes. Has there been a point where the relations between the U.S. and the GCC states were not bilateral with each one of them? I mean, it's from what I've seen, mainly, at least in my experience, is that it has been bilateral.
Yes, I mean, our relationships are bilateral with each state. We have a relationship with each GCC country out there. Okay. Obviously, it differs in many ways with each one of them, but we've maintained those bilateral relationships. I don't see in the future that we would cut off any of those.
Oh, absolutely. I meant versus having like a multilateral relationship. Versus,
well, that's what we're after. We're after a multilateral relationship. I mean, that's what MESA is. I mean, that's what we're trying to construct here. And we don't want to. And again, from what I've seen in the last couple of administrations, I don't think anybody wants to go out there and impose in any way or some sort of structure, or to look like we're coming in with the answer. I think we want to, again, start some sort of collective agreement that we can build on as to what the region can stand and how we can begin to work on the issues of that we've been talking about on interoperability and cooperation. And again, I would say we really wanted this to go beyond just the security and the military aspect too. I mean, obviously there are economic and political and energy and all sorts of issues that we need some sort of cooperative approach on.
So there hasn't been an instant where there was multilateral cooperation.
Yeah, Desert Storm.
Yes, and you found that to be a very useful and successful way to engage. And do you think that could reoccur again?
Well, I think where there are a couple things that made the situation worse where it couldn't be built upon. One was going into Iraq, which I was opposed to. I didn't see the need for it. Saddam was contained, and certainly we had bigger fish to fry with Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and then doing it without a UN resolution, which made it more difficult to get cooperation in the region. I think the Arab Spring, obviously there were a lot of bad feelings created in Egypt and elsewhere as a result of what occurred in the Arab Spring, and trying to understand where the U.S. position was, and people that objected to the positions we took. And again, I don't want to get into defending what any administration did. I'm not political in any way. But those strains made it more difficult, and they resulted in a lack of trust in the United States. And whether that was justified or not, it's there. I see it especially in the case of Egypt, but elsewhere too. There were strong feelings in the UAE and Saudi Arabia that we didn't take a strong position in past administrations vis-a-vis Iran when they did, and thought we had their back. So that's their view. I'm not coming down on either side or trying to take a political position or justifying or criticizing any past political decisions, but those all go into the mix to damage the trust between the U.S. and certain nations in the region, and between certain nations in the region.
I have a series of questions about threat perceptions. Given that, and I'm reading the question, given that you have said accurately regarding different views of the threat, what would be, in your definition, a threat that is common for GCC plus Egypt and Jordan, which might persuade the players to coalesce to some degree? And then there's another question about, do you think that there's going to be a different prioritization in threats in the Gulf region after the COVID-19 crisis? And would that affect the security architecture?
Well, I mean, in terms of the current pandemic, we have to see how this pans out. I mean, if there's a vaccine and it's effective, the efficacy of the vaccine is strong, and I mean, we could get beyond this. One thing we would learn by it is it's another reason why we need cooperation, on not just regionally but globally on things like this. I think it might be an incentive for more in terms of more cooperation. It might spur us to do that. But I think in terms of threats, we can talk about it in general terms. I mean, obviously, there's the threat of terrorism and extremism that is commonly accepted or understood. We can look at things like preserving territorial integrity, which means if there's some sort of hegemonic designs that occur, or outside coalitions that are formed, again, without identifying anybody, these are the kinds of things that you protect against. I mean, you can articulate the threats in terms of capabilities that might be used against you, as opposed to identifying those capabilities with specific, nations.
Okay, we have another question. Could you share your assessment of the Russian proposal for a new Gulf security architecture that has also been supported by China?
Yeah, I think, I mean, that's a decision that's going to have to be made in the region. Do they want to invite them in? I mean, if you invite them in with some sort of military presence, you make it more difficult for the United States to operate there, and you create a hostile environment where, you may bring in two antagonists into the region and actually compound the potential for miscalculations and conflict if you do that. I mean, you can't choose all sides. I mean, there's a decision has to be made into the region. Which way do you want to go? You can't have forces from 3 or 4 global powers in there that have competitive or adversarial relationships between them, and you bring them into the theater. I mean, you're asking for the potential of problems that would come with that kind of mix that's present in there. We're going to have all these ships into the Persian Gulf. Could there be a miscalculation? Could there be a misunderstanding? Could there be an incident that flares up, and then the region is caught up in it? So, I would caution my friends in the region to be careful about inviting in. You have to make a choice as to who you're going to bank on for your security, and who you're inviting in, and what their motivations are to be there. You can't sort of placate everybody. I mean, I mentioned before, you can't have 3 or 4 different air defense systems, and because you want to please everybody, because that's going to be a difficult environment, and it invites catastrophe if you do it.
Yes. And another question. Since the time of the RDJTF, the unarticulated threat has usually been Iran. Does an effective regional security architecture necessitate a permanent state of hostility between the US and Iran? And that's a question from one of the members of our audience.
Well, there was a time, if I understand the question correctly, there was a time when I first came in this, when I was the deputy commander at the CENTCOM, and then when I became commander, what kept me awake at night was the hostile action between Iranian ships and our U.S. ships out there. There were incidents where their ships were bumping into ours and challenging them, and I thought for sure one of our captains was going to get to the point where it was an unacceptable incident, and we would end up escalating into something really disastrous. The election of Khatami and the easing of tensions, and we saw a major change in how the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, naval forces, and others reacted. This hostility and deliberate provocations dropped off. And the Clinton administration at the time said, is there any way we can sort of respond to that? It looks like they're easing back. And we suggested things like maybe we create some sort of net out there, communications network, where we can deconflict things right away so they don't explode if something happens and escalate. And also that maybe we go into things that are confidence building measures like cooperative search and rescue. So if an Iranian sailor or a U.S. sailor or a fisherman, was in trouble or fell overboard, we would work together in some way. So, I think if other tensions were relaxed and there was a more cooperative atmosphere created, there are things you could do that are like these confidence building measures that you could put in place, especially ones that can easily de-escalate anything that might happen before it gets out of control and we end up with major confrontation taking place.
Okay, and another question is, and this is a hypothetical one, if elected, will Biden continue the existing structure and arrangement? You think he would seek to have a MESA? And do you think that our relationship with Iran would be the same?
Oh, geez, I don't know. I mean, you're asking me a political question, first of all. I mean, like I said, I'm apolitical. I don't know. I think that it would be in the best interest for us to continue to push for a MESA-like agreement or alliance. I would hope that another administration, if one comes in, would do that and put emphasis on it. I'll tell you one thing I learned in the process: you have to have the president behind it. The only way you get the leadership in the region to move is not because General Zinni comes out there and says, let's do this. It's got to come from the top. Initially, when we started the process with trying to begin a MESA arrangement, we were to have a summit in the U.S. and we were to have the president with the major leadership from the region. That focuses people and gets people to move. But like I said, when you begin a process at a lower level, it's got to keep moving up. But eventually, it's going to have to take the top leadership involvement. So, whoever it is, even if it's this current administration or if it's one that follows it, the one advice I would give is this really takes the president to get involved and to make it happen. This isn't going to happen through foreign ministers and secretaries of state or even lower echelons beginning a process that moves its way up unless there's agreement and willingness at the very top to bring it together in some fashion.
Okay, another question, which is apolitical. Has the U.S. Also considered MESA as a way to progress towards an eventual weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East? Or is it more favorable to keep these strategic concerns separate from the U.S. Relationship with the region?
Well, I think when you look at, we had the four pillars through the energy pillar. One of the things that might be put on the table is some sort of addressal of nuclear power and nuclear weapons. I mean, that could be something that comes up. Obviously, not everybody in the region may agree to that, but it could be something that within a MESA construct that people want to work on and develop. I don't think it would be easy. I think in terms of talking about nuclear power as an energy source, that would be something that would be, I think, interesting to discuss when we get into weapons and that would be a major decision that would have to be done with the cooperation of countries, obviously outside of just GCC +2.
This is a big one. I think that everyone is always concerned about. Has the U.S. influence diminished in the last few decades, given that, and this is from somebody from the audience, that we have a large economic influence, military forces arrayed throughout the region? How do you see us proceeding with influence in the next decades?
In the next decade, I think there needs to be, more political cooperation. On a military-to-military basis, we do fine. I've never found the case where with the GCC +2 where our military relationships weren't good. But it's the political relationships that we need to work on. I mentioned before, as a result of the Arab Spring, as a result of the decision post 9/11 to go into Iraq and other things that occurred out there, the political relationships have been strained, not only between the U.S. and some of the countries out there, but amongst some of those countries out there. Again, we talked about the Qatar dispute and others. I think that the most important thing to do is fix the political relationships, internal to the region and then external with the U.S. That's the key to making anything proceed. Generals will get along. I mean, I've never encountered a relationship problem military to military, but obviously we have political masters. The political relationships are what's strained or broken in many cases and need the priority put on them. So whether it's security in a military context or whatever, whether it's energy, whether it's economics, whether it's diplomatic or political, it all can't move forward unless the relationships at the very top are fixed in some way. There are too many political issues on the table that are the major stumbling blocks for us moving forward on any sort of cooperative arrangement.
And given the reduced U.S. reliance on external energy supplies, how does the U.S. strategic interest in the Gulf differ from what it was a few years ago or 20 years ago?
Well, in one way, it differs because it differs because we are less dependent from the U.S. perspective on energy from the region, although there's a realization that we need we understand the importance of the energy resources to the global economy. I think Obviously, the United States has gotten deeper interests in the Pacific and other places too, which have become more prominent in some of the strategic decision making in the more current administration. So, you know, the emphasis on the Pacific by the last two administrations, the energy independence of the United States, although we shouldn't deceive ourselves that we wouldn't suffer economically if the resources from the energy resources from the region were not available. I think too that, you know, we've been through 9/11 and its aftermath and where that's taken us and what's happened, and it's caused some strained relationships. I think the view of Iran, you know, from administration to administration, and the inability to move on a positive direction with Iran, that's you know, that, you know, there was some hope when obviously there was the agreement on the nuclear weapons, but development, but those are significant changes. So, you know, the one thing we have to realize is, you know, things change decade to decade. Relationships change. Our relationship with Egypt, our relationship with Turkey is much different than it was, you know, 10, 15, 20 years when I was CENTCOM commander. That changes the complexion out there too. So, you know, again, each decade brings a difference, just like each change in leadership brings a difference too.
And I think we will leave it with that big point there. Thank you, General Zinni, for your time and your expertise. We truly appreciate it. It was definitely an intellectually stimulating discussion. And also, I want to thank our audience for joining us for the conversation, and apologize for the technological issues, and looking forward to engaging you all for future discussions about the Gulf region.
Thank you, Dania.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Take care.